Right, so this is a video about Richard the Lionheart for Warwick Words History Festival. My name is Ben Kane. Thank you to Helen Meek and to the um, other organisers. And with luck, we'll get this to run like this. Share screen. Okay, so I'll make a start. Welcome to this talk on Richard the Lionheart, the King of England, the iconic war leader who has had many books and texts and indeed films made about him. And I'm going to talk about my book, which is about him in the first, in his younger years, and then when he became king. It's the first part of a trilogy, aptly named Lionheart. It came out in May this year. So let's see if we can get this to work. This is a seal surviving from the 12th century of Richard, an official seal. It's always fascinating when you get items like this that survive the ravages of time. Clearly dressed as a Norman knight with the mail down as far as his knee and a massive sword and that what is known as a heater shield. So the kite shield you'd seen of Normans using at the invasion of England in 1066. They chopped the top off it by now, so it was flat topped and it was known as a heater shield. There's a fairly iconic image on the left there. Everybody knows that one, I'm sure. That's Sean Connery in the Kevin Costner Robin Hood film. Not very accurate, really, although he's great. But a more accurate image there, probably on the right. Note that the fact that there are only two lions on that shield, which I'll talk about in more depth later on. So that's me. In a previous existence, I am actually a veterinary surgeon. I worked as a vet for 16 years, 10 years in the UK, and mostly small animal. But in 2008, I had my first book published, and I've been lucky enough to be a full-time author since December 2008. I've written 14 published novels, published in 13 languages, sold more than 1 million books, and Lionheart is the first one that's set outside the ancient world. That's just a little initiative that I got going during lockdown in March. I got it started in the first week of lockdown. Look that up if you want to read some great short stories from more than a dozen authors. And these are the kind of things that I do. I walked Hadrian's Wall in full Roman gear in 2013 with two friends, Anthony Riches and Russ Whitfield. And I also raise money for these charities here. You know the ones at the top, I'm sure. At the bottom there, this is Park in the Past, a fantastic initiative on the Welsh-English border near Chester that's building a Roman fort, the likes of which do not exist in Britain at this time. I also work as a bike guide, Bike Odyssey, and another company called Ride and Seek, leading people on amazing month-long tours from, for example, Barcelona to Rome over the Alps, called the Hannibal. Similar ones called the Napoleon, and other historical figures, the Julius Caesar from London to Rome. And I also lead tours in Pompeii and Herculaneum in the Bay of Naples for Andante Travels. All these have been put on hold, obviously, this year, but should, all things being well, be going again in 2021. That's Cycling the Alps. There's just a plug for the book. So it's on ebook as well as audiobook and available from all good online retailers and still in a lot of Tesco's and obviously bookshops like Waterstones. So we've got to do a bit of backstory before we can talk about Richard, because you may know some of the history of England and France in the 12th century, but it's likely you don't know all of it. So that is Henry II on the left, and on the right there, that's the killing of Thomas à Becket, as you may have guessed from the fact that he's got a tonsure and he's kneeling at an altar and men are busy, trying to kill him. So Henry II was a very, very remarkable king. He took power in the 1150s after a period of civil war in England that had lasted more than a decade, a terrible instability and a lot of deaths. And he ruled for over 30 years. He was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, who brought with her an enormous dowry, Aquitaine being an area of probably over a third of the size of modern France. So at a single swoop, Henry II's territories were expanded massively, and I'll show you a map of that. He was somebody that managed to juggle the balance of power with his potential enemies with the King of Scotland and bigger enemies like the King of France constantly through his reign. And he also had the problems with his own family. So, for example, his wife Eleanor fomented a rebellion by several of his sons in 1173, and this ongoing squabbling and feuding in the family was to feature pretty much always from then on. Although there were periods of peace, it was the struggles with his sons that kind of marked the end of his reign, and indeed with Richard when Richard was coming to power. This is Fontevraud Abbey in the Loire. That's Henry II and his wife's tomb. Their bodies aren't in there. They were got rid of during the Revolution, but these are the original tombs. Just a taste to show you what France and southern England look like. Strigul is modern day Chepstow. Southampton features in the book as well, and then France, where the word France is there, that kind of shows you the size of France under the King of France. Most of the rest of the map, apart from Toulouse and Burgundy, belonged to the King of England, and obviously then to his sons, who he gave territories to. So a very different map of France to what exists today. We've got to talk about Ireland as well, because the main character in the book, his name is Ferdia, which amusingly for me anyway, it's my son's name. It's an ancient Irish name, and his name is Rufus, given to him by the English / Normans, because they don't find it easy to pronounce his name. So Ireland at this time, when the book opens in the late 1170s, was still nominally independent, a lot of it, but after the invasion by Normans in 1169, which started down in Wexford in the southeast, the area of conquest extended up north of Dublin, not all the way to the modern border with Northern Ireland, but not too far from that, and not very far inland at all. So the Pale, this was called. That's where the expression "beyond the Pale" comes from. The Irish were a very rural nation. There were 5 provinces at the time, and there was a High King. But by 1179, the High King and the other provincial kings, apart from the King of Ulster, had submitted to the rule of Henry II. So in name, at least, he was king, although the area of conquest had not really gone very far. That would take in more than 100 years to sort of fully encompass the island of Ireland. The Irish were regarded by the English and Welsh as sort of barbarians, who used axes. They'd adopted them from the Vikings, and people who slaughtered animals and had their kings bathe in the blood of these animals and eat raw flesh of such slaughtered animals. And so would their followers, largely based on ignorance. I mean, the evidence, such as it is, doesn't suggest this was the case at all, but the scholar / cleric Gerald of Wales, some of whose texts survive, this is the kind of thing he wrote about. The man that invited the Normans in, his name was Diarmaid MacMurrough, that's him on the left. He was a small king from the province of Leinster who was having squabbling with his overlord, the King of Leinster, and he came over to England and tried to get the help of Henry II a couple of times before he succeeded, and eventually Strongbow, I'm sure you've heard of him, de Clare was his surname, a powerful Norman, came over with some hundreds of men, and they were able to wreak havoc among the Irish, because the Irish at that time did not fight with armor, and they had very few cavalry as such. So the Norman knights in their heavy mail, with covered completely literally from head to toe, because they often wore leggings of mail as well, with massive shields and also crossbows. These are images on the left there. That's from a church in Italy. You can see the mail on those riders there, and that image on the top right, you can see as well how much protection a man would have. And when you're fighting light infantry / skirmishers, which is what essentially the Irish were, you've got a massive advantage. That's a dagger. These aren't to scale, so that dagger is not the same size, nearly the same size as that sword, but these are 12th century weapons and equipment. Very simple helmet there. You can see literally just a cone of iron, or steel, and but it was more protection than most Irish had. That's a 12th century mail. It's almost a full set of leggings, you can see. This is from Chinon Castle, and let me tell you, a find as complete as that is incredible, absolutely incredible. That's one of the helmets that was just coming in the late 12th century. Much more protection than those simple caps, and massively heavy, up to 5 kilos, about 10 or 11 pounds. So you didn't wear one of them until you absolutely had to go into battle. Although this is a hunting crossbow, it is 12th century as well. Again, another fantastic find. This is from Chinon too. So the Irish lived in villages and not many towns. And what the Normans did, Normans who were known as the English to the Irish people, when they came in, they would build these motte and bailey castles. These are examples in Ireland. Left there is Trim Castle, which featured in the film Strongbow, and that's a castle in County Limerick. And what they did was they built these massive castles, and that obviously stopped the Irish from moving back into their lands. So back to Britain. This is the front entrance of Chepstow Castle. Although a lot of what you can see is 13th century, or maybe even 14th. Some of the walls that you will see there at the lower level will be 12th century, and the entrance is in the same place as in the 12th century. So this was a castle built by the de Clare family. It's on the river Wye, very close to the Avon, very close to where the motorway M4 bridge comes over. The southern one comes over into Wales. This is the view of the river. You can see that it was obviously built on a bluff above the river. And that's an image of what it looked like. So the top layer, that second top layer, would have been 13th century, but the ground floor and the basement would have been what existed in the 12th century when the book is set. And there would have been just a palisade around the top of this hill rather than a wall. Still a mightily strong place for you to build your residence and to stop the locals attacking you. That is the original door on the left from the 12th century. Absolutely incredible. Things like that blow my mind. Richard the Lionheart was on the throne of England when that door was being used. The little postern gate there you can see as well. And there on the right, that's the Great Hall. So that lower level would have been cellars and storage facilities, stuff being brought up from the river level, hauled up by rope probably, and maybe prison cells. And then the first floor with that archway, that massive archway at the end, that was the massive Great Hall, your classic Great Hall of a castle or fortress of the time. And then the floor above was built later than the 12th century by the Bygod family, or possibly by the Marshals, who I'll talk about in a second as well. So back to Richard and family feuding. His mum and dad, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry II, and there he is. So he was crowned Duke of Aquitaine, and given that role by his father when he was only 14 years old, and by the age of 16, think of a 16-year-old nowadays and what we let them do. By the age of 16, he was in charge of Aquitaine and leading armies into battle. And the reason I have the image there of the siege engine, and that's a castle, that red structure is a castle, is that he was thrown at once into the maelstrom of Aquitanian politics, which was a very febrile place. The nobles of Aquitaine, just like anybody back then, they generally didn't take kindly to overlords, particularly an overlord who was from another country. In other words, Richard being the son of Henry II, although they had been French originally, they had been in England for over 100 years. So they were now, to the French, these were now English. They weren't Normans. Normans in the what we would call modern day France, in the late 12th century, Europe were known as Norman. The people from England were known as English, and the people from Normandy were known as Normans. So I'm not going to say Normans like you would think of William the Conqueror. If you hear me talking about Normans from now on, it's men from Normandy. That's a picture of the siege of Carcassonne in the Cathar rebellion. So it's not from this exact sort of historical timeline, but it just gives you an idea of what a siege might be like. siege warfare was very much the norm at this time. Big set-piece battles were very rare indeed, and armies were much smaller than they had been, for example, in the Roman times. Now, this was just a sort of evolving of warfare. It was immensely expensive to field large armies, and also uh, set-piece battles were very dangerous because the leaders and high-ranking officers, if you like, or commanders, if they were killed, then you lost your struggle, you lost your war. So when Richard, as Duke of Aquitaine, was trying to subjugate a rebellious noble, or his father was, he didn't want particularly to fight a set-piece battle, because if, for example, Henry II was killed in a squabble over a small area of territory, he would be dead, the kingdom would be thrown into turmoil. So what was more normal was for Richard, in this instance, to march into areas of Aquitaine that were rebelling against him, to lay siege to a castle. Incredibly, for such a young man, usually succeed, receive the submission of the rebellious noble, often tear down the walls of that castle so they couldn't immediately rise up again after he'd left, and go away again. And so full-on face-to-face confrontation between armed bodies of men was not that common, which is actually a good thing, because obviously such battles tend to have huge death tolls. These are models in Chinon Castle of those catapults, and there are some of the original stones on the left, and those are small ones. They could be much bigger than that. You may have been to Warwick Castle and seen the giant one there. So Richard cut his teeth in Aquitaine right through until the late 1170s and early 1180s. And this is part of Aquitaine. It's near Limoges. It's what you call the Limousin today, and it's an area of rolling trees and fields, and where he marched and campaigned most summers. And by the time the book has reached sort of 1182, he had literally a string of successes, probably 15, 20 castles that he'd taken over the previous number of years. He was a very, very accomplished military leader, and had won a number of small set-piece battles as well. Limousin cattle, they come from that area. Perhaps his most successful or most remarkable siege that he succeeded in winning was Taillebourg, or Taillebourg in French. Excuse my pronunciation if it's not great. The green on the left is actually a river, and that quadrangle, sort of not quite rectangle in the center, that's where the castle was. And there, at about sort of 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, you can see the remains of a tower, and you can see there's a ditch there. That's it there. These are the remnants today of this fort, and it was impregnable. It was so impregnable that no one had actually tried to take it until Richard. And one of his rebellious nobles was, this was his castle, and he parceled himself up in there with his men, and Richard came to take it. And in 1179 this was, and the defenders were thumbing their noses presumably at Richard and his men. So what he did was he had his men camp really close to the walls, stupidly close, so that they could be attacked easily, and then got them to pretend to light their fires and make merry and sit down and cooking meals and so on, looking as if they didn't have any inclination to be worried about the defenders. And what happened then was that the defenders thought, oh, what an opportunity, let's go and attack. And when they came out and attacked Richard's men were waiting for them, attacked them, defended themselves, and turned the defenders' attack into an attack of their own, and swept them back so fast against the gate of the castle that they managed to get inside, and they took the castle just like that in a couple of hours. So this was an incredible success for Richard. Now, this is an image of the time. Like a lot of these images you see, and these are from religious manuscripts and or histories. A fantastic image there. The two crowned figures on the right, the one holding the vessel is Henry II, and the one at the table accepting it is his son, his eldest son, Henry, known as the Young King. And this is where Henry, because Henry the Young King was his heir, and he made him almost co-ruler when he was still a very young man. And this was to cause the young man, the heir, and Henry, he then became, or maybe he'd always been, but certainly from that point onward, we're told by the sources, he always had a sense of he had everything but nothing. So he was the heir, but he didn't have any territories, and he had a sort of constant sense of aggrievement towards his father, because Richard had Aquitaine, Geoffrey, the next brother, had Brittany, and John, who was the youngest son, he was known as Lackland because he didn't have any land, but he was to be then promised Ireland. So the young king, who was going to take the throne eventually, didn't have any territory, and he was not happy about that. And if we believe the sources, he was a great lover of the good life, of tourneys and mock tournaments and carousing and drinking and so on. And he had risen up in rebellion with Richard in 1173-74, and by the early 1180s was still not happy. There's an image of John on the right. Obviously, whoever painted that put the crown on his head sideways deliberately. So this was at a period, this would have been well before John was king, because you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't paint a picture like that of a king, because unless you wanted to lose your own head. And on the right there, you have the famous crest with the 3 lions on it, still used today, obviously, on England football jerseys and so many other images. It's important to note at this stage that Henry II had used 2 lions on his shield and his devices. And when Richard became king, he were fairly confident that he actually only used 1 lion for a period, and then adopted 3. So, you know, it's a case of, we're not quite sure about these things, but those are the facts as we understand. So when I was asked about the cover of my book, I mean, the publishers wanted to put 3 lions on it because everybody recognizes it, and I thought, well, I'm not going to argue. You know, we don't actually know the exact dates, but we think that Richard adopted 3 lions, possibly around the time he was crusading in the Holy Land. This is William Marshall, a very famous figure. You may have heard of him. Some great books by Elizabeth Chadwick about him, and one of the most remarkable figures of the 12th and 13th century. And from a relatively small noble family, he was one of the most loyal servants of Henry the Young King through much of his life. And when the Young King died, this man Marshall was able to transfer his loyalties to Henry II, which is quite incredible because often people get tossed aside, but he was renowned as being incredibly loyal, and so much so that Henry took him as his vassal. And when Henry II died and Richard took the throne, Richard took on Marshall as one of his as men, and indeed gave him a position of huge responsibility when he went on crusade to the Holy Land. And even more remarkably, when Richard died, John had Marshall as an advisor, and he was even an advisor to the king who came after John. So, and that's his tomb on the right. Managed to make his own star rise massively with his service to all these kings. So he was given the territory of Strigil, Chepstow Castle today. He married De Clare, Strongbow's daughter, whose name was Isabel, and became one of the most powerful nobles in England and Wales as a result. So he's in the book as well. And this is Chinon Castle. Sorry about the angle, but I want to try and get in all the buildings. It's an amazing place in the Loire Valley. And now a lot of that structure is post 12th century. You know, you get to these places and you're rarely, if it's was somewhere that was used for centuries, you don't get the original structure. But that is the site of the main hall. That's one of the views there. This is a massive fireplace in one of the inside the Great Hall, and that's a computerized image. They give you these iPads that when you go into a room, it recreates what the rooms look like. So obviously those bare stone walls are because the paint didn't survive 8 centuries, but they would have been very richly painted and very, very brightly colored. So there are three sections in the book, and the second section deals with 1182-83. It opens, there's a scene that opens around the town of Gore. You can see there on the left the signpost. All those towns are to do with Richard the Lionheart. This is the Limousin. Châlus is where he died, as you probably know. Aix-sur-Vienne is a town that was controlled by Richard. Middle pictures a Norman church in this area. I just couldn't believe it when I was there last summer and this summer, 2020. The place is littered with 13th century churches and 12th century churches. On the right there, that's Châlus, and that's a 12th century tower and a 12th century gateway. This is where Richard the Lionheart took his death wound in 1199. But in February 1183, there were mercenaries who were known as routiers. They were employed by everybody from the French king to the English king to all the different lords in Aquitaine and other parts of France. And they were active in this area. And they were attacking towns and villages that belonged to Richard. And so, in a feat of endurance that was quite remarkable, he took a small force of probably only a couple of hundred men, and he was a good 100 miles north of this area, up towards the direction of north of Limoges towards Paris. And he rode day and night for 2 days through snow and ice to attack the routier at Gore. And there's a video there which you can't see. Oops, sorry. And what he did was he basically, killed them all, including the knights that were in charge of them, which was very unusual for the time. And he established, his control over the area. So this was also the time when his two brothers, Henry the young king and Geoffrey, rose up in rebellion against their father, and Richard stayed loyal to Henry II. So it was Henry and Richard against the young king and Geoffrey. And lots of the nobles in this area that I've mentioned a lot, Aquitaine and from Toulouse as well, they never liked the English either. They were getting involved, and so there was this sort of rising rebellion in and around Limoges and to the south, rumbling on for months. That was a big threat to the English king's power and territories in modern day France. And it all kind of came to a fizzling stop when, in May 1183, this is Roc Amador, which you may have visited if you've ever been in that part of France on holiday, a fantastic cliff-top village. You can see on the left there how those buildings at about 9 o'clock they're perched on an almost vertical cliff. It's about, oh my goodness, 60 degrees to the horizontal, and at the top there's a shrine. It was one of the most famous shrines in France at the time. And the young king, who'd been, he needed money constantly because he had an army in the field, a lot of mercenaries. He had taken to sacking shrines. That's how low he'd sunk. And so he came to this Roc Amador, and his men literally stripped the place of all the holy relics and the gold plate and chalices and so on they could find. That arched gateway with the building above on the right is a almost contemporary, it's 13th century, so almost contemporary building from this time. And he was taken sick, we don't know with what, but probably something like dysentery, because that was very common at the time, in armies, not using proper hygiene when they were in camp, with lack of toilet facilities and so on. And he took sick and died very quickly. So when he died, he was the figurehead of the rebellion, and Geoffrey was quick to abandon the cause, and all the rebellious nobles faded away, and peace was restored to the kingdom. Now, this is Philip Capet of France. He was a very young man when he took the throne, only a teenager, and although he was physically not very strong and unappealing, so kind of pasty-faced, probably blind in one eye, dressed like a peasant. He had a very sharp mind. He was not a battle leader, but he had a very sharp mind, and he was to be the great rival, first of Henry II, and then later of Richard. And he had played a very good game when Geoffrey and the young king were rebelling, making friendly overtures to them, because obviously he was just stirring the pot of family discontent and so on, all with a view to improving his own angle. And from 1183 onwards, there was peace to about 1186, 87, but there were always political machinations going on between Philip and nobles that were in the English territory that he would have been trying to orchestrate unrest and, you know, basically unhappiness, and indeed making overtures to Richard during this time. And so Richard actually became quite good friends with him, and this was because he'd fallen out with his father, who would not name him as heir, although he was now the oldest son, because Geoffrey had died, although he was younger than Richard anyway, but he had died since the death of the young king. Richard had been heir apparent, but had not been named by his father, and we think this is because he thought the young king had been wrecked by being named as co-ruler too young. Regardless of the reason, this caused a great schism between Richard and his father. And so that's just a map. Apologies for the quality. It's actually taken from my book. Just to show you Rock Amador there down towards 6 o'clock, and a lot of other areas. You can see Limoges, quite a mountainous area to the east. And so in October 1187, so the third section of the book rolls forward to then, you had an event that took place not in Europe, but had massive impact there. And that was in Israel. You had a battle at a place called Hattin, which you can see there if you look carefully. Just you can see the coastline where it says Acre and Jaffa, just inland you've got Hattin. And so you'll probably know that there was a crusade in the late 1090s that had taken a strip of land, including Jerusalem, from the Muslims in the name of Mother Church. And there had been a crusader kingdom there for about 100 years at this time, nearly 100 years. And it was a precarious state, constantly threatened by the Muslims and constantly suffering from lack of men, lack of soldiers, lack of materials and weapons, and relying on Europeans, so French and English and Welsh and indeed Norwegians and Danish and Germans and Italians and Spanish. Anyone who was a Christian was welcome if they were a fighter. And 1187, after a period of a good 50-60 years where the Muslims were in a great state of disarray, so the powerful cities and sort of ruling areas were Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. And for about 50 or 60 years, until the 1170s, these three power areas or power bases were in a state of flux with weak rulers and or infighting. And it wasn't until a man called Saladin came along who brought Egypt and Damascus under his control that there was a Muslim leader who was strong enough to actually threaten the kingdom of Outremer, the Crusader kingdom. This is one of the Crusader castles. I think that's in Syria today. And so when the armies of Saladin started attacking the Crusaders, or the Crusading kingdom, the king, who was actually one of Richard's former vassals, he was a man called Guy de Lusignan. And he had, well, I don't have the time to talk about how he'd already become king when coming from France, but there were a lot of troubles with the ruling families and so on. And he had married into the ruling family and become king. And in October 1187, Saladin was threatening the north of modern-day Israel near the Sea of Galilee, and gathering together pretty much all the forces of the Christian kingdom. Guy foolishly tried to march through a desert area without enough water and so on. And at the place, at that Saladin there, and on the right there, that's coins of Guy of Lusignan, and a mountainous area called the Horns of Hattin. That's what they look like. There's a double peak there. Now, these are only hills, but that's looking down towards the Sea of Galilee, which you can't see. And I went there in January, and I couldn't use my own photograph because it was raining so heavily. The windscreen wipers of my car were on the fastest setting, and I could only see about 50 yards in front of me. but at this site, the Horns of Hattin, the crusading army suffered an incredible, cataclysmic defeat to the Muslim army, and many thousands of men died and or were taken prisoner. The primary weapon of the Muslims at the time were known as Mamluks or Mamelukes. They were mounted archers using compound bows, like you can see the man on the left there using. So almost as powerful as a competition bow today, made of man-made fibers and materials. As powerful, indeed, nearly or more sometimes than an English longbow. And these men were born horsemen who carried quivers with many arrows on their thighs, or just off the back of the saddle, and they could ride around the Frankish knights or the Christian knights, loosing arrows, punching through their armor because that's how powerful their bows were, and causing absolute havoc. Supposedly like a cloud of gadflies. They would fly in and sting you. You swat at them, they fly away, and then they come back in again. And so the secret of winning battles for the heavy armored Christian knights was to hold their discipline and only charge when the enemy was gathered together, not to charge them when they were attacking you in waves, whatever, because then you would lose. And at Hattin, there was basically everything went wrong, and the Christians lost. That Saladin there, he actually beheaded one of the nobles himself, one of the Christian nobles he took prisoner. He didn't execute Guy, who's there with a very startled expression, because kings don't kill kings. But he took pretty much every single city then, fell very quickly or just surrendered. So Jerusalem surrendered. And by the beginning of 1188, the only cities left in Christian hands were very few very small forts and the coastal town of Tyre, which is in southern Lebanon, very close to the border with Israel, and as you may well know, was a Phoenician city, and fell in siege to Alexander the Great. And many thousands of the Christian soldiers were sold into slavery, which was obviously pretty horrific. I suppose better than dying. And the news that reached Europe weeks later, if not months, because I think the battle happened in July and it didn't reach Richard until October 1187. So this was terrible news, sort of a stain on the honor of Christians. Remember that everybody was much more religious than a lot of people are today in secular Britain or Europe. And Richard took the cross immediately. He swore the day after he heard the news. He went into Tours Cathedral and promised that he would go on crusade. And perhaps shamed by this, or certainly, it looked like their honor was impugned if they didn't. His father promised to go, and so did Philippe Capet, the King of France. But Richard wasn't able to do this because he wasn't able to leave, because the power situation in France and in the English kingdom was such that it wasn't at all a good idea, because by this stage he was squabbling with his father, and he was also very friendly with the French king. And over the next 2 years, you had this game of demands by Richard to be recognized as heir. His father would refuse, and then as relations between him and his father deteriorated, eventually Richard, who was a very powerful warlord in his own right, took matters into his own hands, and with the aid of the French king, started actually attacking territories belonging to his father. And then you would have peace negotiations, which sometimes worked and more often didn't, and a period of truce, and then a breakdown in the truce. And this went on for a good 18 months. And by 1189, Henry II was getting old and sick and losing the sort of will to fight. And Richard and Philip Capet were still very much in league with each other. And it culminated in a confrontation in northern France, close in an area known as the Vexin, Vexin, which was close to Normandy, eastern Normandy, where Richard met his father and demanded that he recognize him as his heir, or he would invade in full force. And weak and broken hearted, we think, Henry II agreed to this, but said something horrible in the ear of Richard as he was parting. And soon after that, in July 1189, he died. Richard came to see his father's body, is recorded as having stood over his father's body without any emotion whatsoever on his face. And then almost immediately at the same meeting, took William Marshall aside and said, "Are you with me?" And Marshall said he was. And very swiftly after receiving various offices in northern France, he crossed over to England in late August 1189, and he was crowned king in Westminster Cathedral in September 1189. That's an image of him there. And he became the King of England and obviously Wales and all those territories in France. That's just an image of when he went on crusade. Absolutely incredible scene it must have been. I'll go back there to Richard at his coronation, because that's where the first book ends, and the second book, which I've finished writing and in the process of editing in September 2020 for publication in April next year, is called Crusader. That will cover from his coronation through to when he went to Israel and then fought Saladin and then came back from the Holy Land. And the third book, which will come out in 2022, is about his imprisonment in Austria and how he had to be freed and so on and got back to England, and John had made his attempt on power by then. So I thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and please take a look at the book, and I hope you enjoy that as well. Thank you very much.